Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Apotheosis on in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 41, Oh, you mean elves. First, this wasn't my idea, Josephine began, meeting me at the top of the stairs. It is an issue born of titles and heir apparency, and Halam Shirel has asked that you pass judgment on the late Duchess de Chalons. Arriving back at Skyhold to find Floriane's rotting corpse stuffed in a box and left on my doorstep did little to improve my mood after the unpleasant edge of our journey. The enormous crowd gathered in the great hall parted as I strode inside, eager to see the spectacle about to unfold, but I'd at last found the extent to which I'd tolerate Orlshi on politics. Murdering her didn't send a clear enough message. I slouched onto the throne, too tired to even pretend at courtly manners. Fine. Guilty. Done. Seal it up, send her back, and tell them not to waste my time. Again, my apologies, the ambassador winced. I waved her off. No, Josephine, it's not yours to apologize for. It's just been. I've seen all too much of this particular corpse. You should retire, your worship. If you like, we could have the kitchen. Come to the tavern with me, Josephine. I can't bear to have a mannered dinner in my quarters right now. She paused, perhaps surprised that I should want her company outside of some discreet purpose. Gods, it was the game that made me even wonder that. Very well. If you will allow me to finish the paperwork so that we can be rid of, she gestured toward the box, I will meet you there within the candle mark. Perfect. It was odd to be in the tavern together while not playing a round of Wicked Grace, but also oddly delightful to speak to Josephine on matters outside of etiquette and the Inquisition. Instead, we had a surprising conversation about Antivan brandy, which I knew nothing about aside from the fact that it got the job done in fewer swigs than ale, a crucial consideration for elven stomachs. She was a little horrified that I'd always taken it from the bottle or a flask instead of a proper glass, so after we'd finished our chicken pies she had Cabot send out 2 snifters of the stuff. She cupped the glass in both hands. See? Like this. As your fingers warm the glass, the brandy opens itself like a rose, revealing nuance you cannot find in the cold. I mimicked the motion, and after a minute she raised her glass and inhaled deeply. Ah. It is perhaps not the finest, but rather lovely in its own way. Go ahead. My first impression was of the fumes alone, but after they burned away I could smell something more, like embryum and oak. We sipped together and I was amazed to see how much more flavorful it had become. In truth, when it came to brandy my only interest was its effect, but however fine the thread it was nice to discover a connection to Josephine not born of the political machinations. Unlike Blackwell, Josephine would not keep me up into the night with endless drinking, so we returned to Skyhold together after one glass warm but unaffected. Mostly unaffected. We parted ways in the great hall and I stepped quietly into the rotunda. I was startled to see Salas had already begun the next panel of his fresco, the late Empress rising up from the floor like a mountain. Archivist Benon himself often stood in awe of its scope, making me feel somewhat less biased in my own admiration. Salas seemed to have so many talents aside from his magic, from language to art and strategy. Iron Bull had vowed never to play chess with him again, and Blackwell said the same of Diamondback. Having no creative talent of my own, it was humbling that I should have nothing to give him in return. Though I had no intent of disturbing him, his focus could be rather singular. Salas called out to me from the scaffolding. There are spirits hovering by the veil to observe the thrones of powerful nations, he said, lost in thought. After our time in Halam Shirel, I understand why. I had forgotten how I missed court intrigue. He was dragging a swath of cerulean plaster to form the slender column of Celine's gown. You miss court intrigue? When were you in court? I didn't mean to sound incredulous, he did seem oddly at home in the Winter Palace, it was just such an intriguing glimpse into his life before the Inquisition. The brush stilled for a split second before smoothly flowing on. Oh. Well, never directly, of course. An elven apostate is rarely invited to speak with empresses and kings. But from the fate I have watched dynasties fall and empires crumble. It is sometimes savage, sometimes noble, and always fascinating. In any event, Gaspard should be a steadfast ally, and Briola will keep him in check. And look after the elves. I felt a swell of pride. Maybe that, in its own way, that was something I could give him, the satisfaction of knowing we'd used the Inquisition to accomplish something for the people. I wouldn't pretend that city elves and Dalish would suddenly join hands to praise Mythil together in song, but it was a start. I hope Briola is able to use her position to help our people. Salas climbed down the ladder and crouched at a pail on the floor to mix a new batch of plaster. Our people? He scoffed. Who are? Oh, you mean elves. I'm sorry, I was confused. I do not consider myself to have much in common with the elves. The elves. Somehow he'd made it a slur, and my own knife ears burned hot. He was still talking, but it might as well have been Tavani. My world had condensed around the implication. Salas did not count me among his people. The weight of it felt like a real thing, pushing me face down into his disdain for the Dalish and all the times I'd thought myself the exception. But it wasn't just the Dalish, it was all of us, the elves. When my Valislan were covered and I was dressed up like Shem, he'd said that I was beautiful. I bumped into his desk as I took a step back. Oh, gods. Is that why you won't? The words were slow and thick in my mouth. Do you see me differently in the fade? He spun around, his face white and expression slack. Teeth touched lips to form the word, Vihanan, and I threw a hand between us. Don't say it. Don't you dare say it. I left the room in a daze, electricity coiling in my stomach as I entered the great hall. I barely registered Varric's expression, but it was enough to tell me he'd heard every damn word. I heard the scuffle of a chair and a sudden rush of motion as I left the keep, voices low and sharp as Varric intercepted Salas at the door. I didn't think, just leapt from the top of the staircase, the uplift of a mind blast cushioning my fall to the lower bailey. A sharp whistle brought Chardon trotting out from his pen, my clever boy. I fisted the shaggy aubergine hair at his withers and took 2 short skips to launch myself upon his broad back. My lady, a figure stepped from the shadows of the stable, cautious. Blackwool. I didn't have the presence of mind then to realize that a saddled horse stood behind him. He didn't say another word, just watched me take Chardon through the muck toward the gate, where the guards had already anticipated my order. The portcullis was lifting with a slow rattle, and I realized for the first time Skyhold was not a prison people moved to obey even before my command. My stag ducked his head to pass under the half-open gate, and I twisted to call out behind me. Don't open the gate till morning. Not for anyone. Yes, Inquisitor. I took the bridge at a walk, mindful that wild hearts have little experience with icy flagstones, but when we crunched through to the snow on the other side Chardon knew exactly what I wanted. Relaxing my legs around the width of him, I opened my hips and lifted my core as he broke into a canter. My thighs tightened to urge him on, and all 2,000 pounds of him gathered beneath me to surge forward, the both of us screaming into the night. Chapter 42, Forgotten Bastards. The snowy pass was a blur around me, and my thoughts raced almost as fast. My people will find a way to repay you, Briola promised me in the Winter Palace. I'd taken her hand. You don't have to repay me, Lethalin, they're my people too. She'd smiled behind her mask, eyes liquid with tears. I'd never even met her before, but in that moment we were bound by far more than the slant of our ears, by blood and history and, perhaps, a future. For our people. Our people. Who are? Oh, you mean elves. Finethys, he sounded like Sira. I'd been spit on before, first time I walked too close to a Shem noble on a visit to Wycombe when my Valislan was still fresh. It came as an awful surprise, a hot swell of shame and embarrassment and confusion that flashed to hurt. That Salas did it with words didn't change what it was. Chardon slowed to a trot as I slumped under the realization of it. I shifted my balance to swing him in a circle. We were some 5 miles from Skyhold, spurred by magic, faster and farther than any horse could have managed in so short a time. I slid from his back and left Chardon by the rocky wall, stalking off until I could be sure that no stray spell would bring him harm. He was steady, fearless, and proud. He'd let me cast my grief into the night without a tether to hold him. But by the time I'd made it out into the clearing, there was simply nothing left to give. No spell would lift the weight, no screaming rage would ease the hurt. I fell knees down in the snow, empty and stunned. Why would he say such a thing? After all the times we'd talked about our people, our history, Our culture. The ghost of a hand caressed my cheek, unable to brush away the tears yet soothing. Amalia. Her specter arced around me, magic tingling where she petted but couldn't quite touch through the veil. Give me form. With a stretch of my fingers, the inky purple smoke of her filled the valley, carefully curling away from Chardon as she raced into the trees along the mountain pass. An instant later there was an awful howling and a roar, followed by terrible silence, and in a moment more a great black bear came lumbering out from the woods. I wasn't so used to her magic or so far from my clan that the sight didn't give me pause. It was a massive thing, hulking in its winter weight, and weeping sickly violet light from each eye. The bear nosed into my chest and huffed a warm breath when I ran my fingers through its shaggy fur. Amalia heaved the beast down to the snow and I huddled into the warmth of it, burying my face in its shoulder and worrying tufts of fur between my fingers, lost in wondering. From the moment we met, I'd counted Salas among my people. Just being near him had been the only thing to keep me from drowning in the Shemlin world. When I needed more to cling to he called me to lend so that I could have a little clan, and when Corypheus destroyed everything we'd built, he welcomed me as Lethalin. And when even that was not enough to keep my panic at bay, Salas called me Vihanan. How could he call me those things and think himself apart from the elves? Gods, was everything the game? He'd been the only mage smart enough to keep the anchor from killing me, the only one savvy enough to theorize how it might seal the breach, and the only one, fucking elfy enough to keep me from flying apart at the seams. Because if I came undone, the breach would swallow the world. He'd said it wasn't the best idea. He'd said it would lead to trouble. Suddenly the bear shifted around me, sitting up on its heels like a mulberry and clutching me against its chest with one massive paw. I clung to it instinctively, wrapping my arms around its neck as Amalia roared around me, an ear-splitting pit of feral rage turned upside down into the night. When she fell silent, a voice called out from the darkness. Leave us, spirit. I tried to find my footing as the bear slumped to the ground, twisting awkwardly to discover Salas stalking toward me with Skyhold at his back. I scrambled away in surprise, falling over the bear's corpse and flat on my ass into the snow. It wasn't possible. Not on foot. Not this soon. It felt like something from the Fade, a nonsense scenario. How are you even here? One corner of his mouth tugged up into a tired smile. How many times have I stepped through the Fade to be at your side? My thoughts ground to a halt. Fade steps I could understand, but miles? Was that how far he could travel without the weight of battle dividing his attention? It wasn't. Who are your people? I demanded. A good question. He was almost on top of me. I joined the Inquisition to save the world. Regardless of whom my people are, this was the best way to help them. This. You. My stomach twisted. This isn't real. He dropped down into the snow, knees between my legs and one hand sliding to grip the back of my neck. I've got you, Vihanan. Don't ever say that. If you reject the elves, you reject me in the same breath. Do you think you so cleverly distracted me from what was left unsaid last night? Salas. What was the price? What would the Dalish require of you to keep your sister with Clan Lavalan? He released me and stood, pacing the way he had after my smite, fingers clenching with magic, and I hurried to my feet wishing some barrier could shield me from what was to come. It would be Haven all over again, but now the debate had lost its charm. Nothing would make him understand and so I held my tongue. They would have traded you to another clan like chattel, he spat. And for what? So some withered keeper could tumble you in a filthy arrival, chance at making another mage? It is vile the Dalish teach such things as duty, even worse that you accept. So, yes, I can reject the Dalish and cherish you in the same breath. Magic is a resource to be cultivated like any other, would you have it die out among the clan? You are not a resource, Vihanan. Tell that to the fucking Inquisition. Whatever my duties is first, they are none of your concern. Are they not? He turned away, fixing his gaze on the snow-covered ground. When you offered yourself to me that night under the stars, I thought that if Andruil had possessed half your grace and beauty, Fenharil would not have escaped. But with neither the power nor the charm of a god, I asked myself, why would this glorious wildling desire a flat-eared Haran? Surely she would not, but perhaps, if he were a mage, she might take him as her duty. The whole world stopped. You can't possibly be serious, I laughed, a smothered sort of gasping in my disbelief. How many forgotten bastards do you suppose I have among the Dalish? I wouldn't know, I said as coolly as I could, because that would involve you opening up to me for once instead of passing off some second-hand memory you picked up in the fade. Emma Irabellas. No other man could hang such weight on those 3 words. It wasn't just sorrow, but anguish that colored his voice and despair that broke his features. He came at me slowly, as if giving me time to turn away, but when I stepped forward he was on me in a rush, crushing me to his chest and pressing kisses into my hair. Emma Irabellas, Emma Lath. Ma sa Lath. I dream of you even when you are awake, I would change nothing, Vihananera, you are perfect, Ma Lath. Beyond that and I was lost in Elven I could not comprehend, ancient words to remind me that those second-hand memories were as real to him as any other. The pain that I'd carried out into the snow twisted into something less sharp, still hurting but less raw. Had he fallen in love with a keeper? Had she seen him as nothing more than a sire? Had he been turned out after finding refuge in a clan, never to see what became of his child? Had he tried to find them in his wandering? Did he seek them in the fade? Arlath ma, Salas, please believe me. He stood so quiet and still, but I did not mistake the hot tears on my cheek for my own. Chapter 43, A Warning Shot. We rode back to Skyhold in silence, but companionably so. I sat behind Salas with my arms wrapped around him, thumbs hooked into the strap of his belt. I pressed my face into the fur of his cloak to hide from the wind, trying to reconcile all that I'd been told. In another world, I would not have had patience for the insults and hurt of the night, but in another world, I would not have known Salas. For him, I would try to understand. I could at least appreciate how he'd come to find himself so at odds with my people. And, as he had made it clear, the Dalish were my people alone. It was no secret that those who fled the alienage often sought refuge among the Dalish, and many such elves had wandered with my clan for a season. A few had the disposition to undertake the rite of Valislan, but for most it was something of a pilgrimage. A chance to play at freedom before slinking back to the shadow of their Vihanadal. Given the familiar routines of life in a clan, visitors came as a pleasant diversion. When Keeper Istama Ethariel led a flat-eared Antavan travel with us on the journey east from Hunter Fell, I certainly hadn't been the only Lavalan to slip into his tent. I should imagine that if magic were scarce in a clan, an elven apostate might expect an even warmer welcome. But to my reckoning, it was harmless either way. Should a child take hold, it would be welcomed. Were such things to be avoided, there were spells for that too. Tavern-goers risked more for less every night. To the Shemlin and city elves, unexpected pregnancies meant hastily arranged marriages and back-alley blood magic, ugly words to sling at mothers and slurs for fatherless children. Worst of all, magelings were turned from their homes and left on the chantry's doorstep. I refused to see villainy in the Dalish way of things, but clearly at some point along his journey some encounter had gone very badly for Salas. I tried to consider his mistrust as involuntary as the way I used to flinch from Cullen's voice. If a Shem Templar could find a way to gain the trust one didn't know how to give, surely I could prove myself to Salas. I feathered my mana against his, hoping to soothe. So you're a father, then? I ventured. Gods, he could be a grandfather if the timing was right. I was very reckless as a young man, he sighed. And restless. I did not linger long enough to know the consequence of my action. I often regret that I did not remain to take responsibility for those I left behind. I rocked against him to the rhythm of Sharden's steady gait, relieved that Salas had not tensed in my arms at the question. The Dalish take care of their own, Emelath, if you have children, they are well loved. You could only be a happy memory to their mothers. There are none among the Dalish who would remember me fondly. Despite the intensity of his pathos, I felt a terrible wave of jealousy. No, not a wave but a flood. That women he cared nothing for had known the pleasure of him while I had not. That I could be his Vihanan without having ever taken him inside me, without having ever tasted him. I can offer a few suggestions if you'd like to redeem yourself to one of them. He laughed in surprise, that charming cultured laugh, and twisted to smile at me over his shoulder. I shall bear that in mind. When we crossed the bridge to Skyhold, The portcullis rattled up to admit us in violation of my previous order, but of course I couldn't bring myself to admonish the guards. To my surprise, Cassandra ran up to meet us at the gate. "What's happening?" "What?" I slid down from Chardon's back, stepped aside for Salas. "Nothing's happening." She pursed her lips and cocked an eyebrow. "You rode suddenly from Skyhold with Blackwall," Varric shot Salas, and then the mage disappeared in a flash of light. "Pardon me if it appears that something is happening." "What?" I glanced sharply between them. "No harm done," Salas said calmly. "Just a warning shot between friends." "Are you fucking serious?" Schemed the edge of my cloak. "Masterfully done." "What of Blackwall, why has he not returned?" Cassandra's concern was rising. "I don't understand." "Blackwall has nothing to do with this." "With what?" "Why did Salas?" "Gods, Cassandra, lovers quarrel, let it go. Blackwall was right here when I left." "Right there. In the shadows." "Cautious." "Fuck." I hurried to the stables. Sure enough, a horse and tack were missing, but a sheet of parchment lay under a carpenter's chisel on his workbench. I snatched it up, schemed over the rough scrawl of words. "It's some sort of farewell, I don't understand." Salas took it from me just as one of the scouts jogged up. "The spymaster confirms it, Blackwall was seen riding west." "West?" "Back to Adamant." I was beginning to appreciate Cassandra's confusion. "On hearts, we could overtake him if we left now," she said. "To what end?" Salas crossed his arms. "Is Warden Blackwall not free to go?" "Of course he's free to go. It's just, it seems like something's forced his hand." A pit of fear coiled in my stomach. This was my fault. I pressed my fingers to my mouth, wide-eyed as the realization hit. Salas gave me a concerned look, but I wished he hadn't. He was going to kill me. He had told me to exile the wardens and I didn't, and now Blackwall had waltzed out of Skyhold with news of Morrigan's Elevian. Dread wolf, I swore, what if it's Corypheus? Another false calling. Blackwall withstood it the first time, but what if it's stronger now? He knows everything. Cassandra took off in a dead run, and I didn't have to ask to know she was after her sword and shield. Salas and I bolted at the same instant, bounding up the stairs to the great hall for our armor. "Did I not warn you about this very possibility?" "I know, Salas." "Fuck. Yes. I know. Varric. With me." By then I was running up to my chambers, Varric confused and on my heels. "Boots. Go wake Master Dennett." I was taking the stairs 2 at a time. "We're going to need 4 fresh stags. Grab Bianca, we're leaving within the Candlemark." "And what, pray tell, is the occasion?" He paused at the corner of the stairwell as I threw open the door to my chambers. "Blackwall's gone rogue." "Well, shit. I'd never pulled on my armor so quickly, I hadn't even cleaned it from the road." By the time we'd all saddled up in the bailey, Leliana was rushing down to us with news from her ravens pointing to where Blackwall may have gone. I hadn't even slept from the journey home, but now I was riding hard for Valroio. So much for getting laid. Chapter 44, A Murderer. A Traitor. A Monster. I fell in line with Varric behind Salas and Cassandra to let their larger frames shoulder through the crowded square in Valroio. It was pouring rain and my feet were covered in city muck. Salas and I had not slept since Halam Shirel, then we'd spent a tremendous amount of mana feeding the hearts as we rode. We both took lyrium at dawn and again when we made it to the outskirts of the city, then restorative potions to make up for the lack of sleep. Needless to say, we felt like shit, and I was grateful Cassandra and Varric were no more than road-weary. Cullen was several hours behind us with a small contingent of soldiers marching under Gaspard's banner so as not to raise suspicions. None of us had any idea what to expect, only that Leliana's spies had reason to believe Blackwall's disappearance coincided with the scheduled execution of a one Cyril Mornay. The withered old man standing on the gallows seemed to have neither the presence nor power of Alexius and Florian, but something about him had drawn Blackwall to the capital. If it were a false calling, something ugly would soon follow. Any attack would be a massacre. There were too many important people in one place and too few for their defense. A masked soldier stepped forward to declare Mornay's crime, the murder of Lord Vincent Callier, along with his entire household, including children and servants. Varric winced as the details emerged. Well, this is grim. Salas glanced down at us and I shook my head, no idea what to make of it. When the executioner hauled Mornay to his feet and slipped the noose around his neck, Cassandra maneuvered so she could have room to draw her sword. I felt a swell of magic building around Salas, flashy and bright from lyrium, and I pushed my aura outward to extend a barrier around the lot of us. If something were to come, it would come soon. Almost on cue, Blackwell's voice rose above the din. Stop. This man is innocent of the crimes laid before him, he was climbing the gallows stair. Orders were given and he followed them like any good soldier. He should not die for that mistake. Relief washed over me. Whatever this mess was, it wasn't an issue of demons or possession. It could be handled. Varric grabbed my arm and squeezed. This was our Blackwell, not some enthralled warden. Then find me the man who gave the order, said the soldier. Oh, shit, Varric said, one step ahead of my own realization. Blackwell. He frowned from the scaffolding, scanning the crowd for a moment before finding me. For one perfect moment our eyes locked, calling up the memory of him standing on the doorstep of my little house and lifting my hand to his mouth. My lady. That had been the last thing he'd said to me, and I knew that everything was about to change. No, I am not Blackwell, he kept his eyes on mine, I never was Blackwell. Warden Blackwell is dead, and has been for years. I assumed his name to hide like a coward from who I really am. But it's over, I'm done hiding. I gave the order, the crime is mine. I am Tom Rainier. Mornay staggered at the confession, but I was riveted in place, frozen, uncomprehending. Blackwell was single-handedly the least duplicitous person I'd ever met, it was insanity. The crowd exploded around us in frantic cries and shouts, while a pair of guards dragged Blackwell. Rainier. From the platform. I was utterly lost and grabbing for Cassandra. What do we do, where do we go? There's nothing to do, Vihanan, Salas gently intervened, that man must answer to Orlais for his crimes. That man? I ignored him, pulling on Cassandra's arm and willing her to listen. Tell me what to do, Cassandra. We have to get there first. Before Lord Callier's allies, before anyone still loyal to Selene. Come with me, she took me by the arm, all but dragging me in her wake. My fingers found Varric's collar, find Cullen. This is military, I need Cullen. Then the surging crowd carried us away and it was all I could do not to lose Cassandra. By the time we arrived at the penitencier, she stood a little taller, spoke a little louder, and chose to embody the title I'd all but forgotten, Hero of Orlais. The clerks couldn't scramble fast enough to please her, and soon enough I was granted access to the dungeon. However opulent the architecture of Orlais, their prisons didn't hold a candle to the one in Haven. Rainwater ran freely from the ceiling, shimmering over the bricks in thin rivulets and forming dirty pools on the floor. I walked the length of the hall to find Blackwell hunched over in the farthest cell, wet hair matted to his head. I didn't take Blackwell's life, he offered. I traded his death. He wanted me for the wardens, but there was an ambush, Darkspawn. He was killed. I took his name to stop the world from losing a good man. But a good man, the man he was, wouldn't have let another die in his place. That took courage. Courage? I killed innocent people, destroyed Mornay's life and the lives of others like him. One moment of courage will not make up for that. Why are you here? He growled. I slumped against the iron bars, unsure of what to say. In truth, his crimes fell so far short of my fears that I felt only relief. Perhaps among the Dalish I'd grown insensitive to the death of a few Shem nobles, but gods, Callier was Selene's general, Gaspard would have him dead by now anyway. Do you think I'd abandon you? I'm bringing you home. Home? Don't you understand? He flew to his feet, and I jumped back to make room for his rage. I gave the order to kill Lord Callier, his entourage, and I lied to my men about what they were doing. When it came to light, I ran. Those men, my men, paid for my treason while I was pretending to be a better man. He shouted and shook the bars, but when his fever peaked he fell to the floor. I'd never seen it before, in all our travels no giant, no demon had ever worn him down, yet here he was kneeling and broken. This is what I am. A murderer. A traitor. A monster. Get up. He said nothing, did nothing, and I felt a wave of doubt just before casting a mind blast that sent him reeling. I said, get up. You came back, and that means somewhere along the line you stopped pretending. So stop pretending you've been defeated now and get the fuck up. It's a lot harder for a man to stay down when he's flat on his ass, much less dignified and all that, so he finally stood. His eyes were spitting fire, though, and that was fine. It was a hell of a lot better than whatever he was drowning in before. Chapter 45, Showing Face. Josephine was ultimately the one to free Tom Rainier. We knew Gaspard would have given him to us gladly, but Josephine didn't want us to be seen calling on favors from the Emperor so quickly. With great reluctance, the ambassador pulled on her connections with the Council of Heralds instead. In the end, they declared an ongoing state of war that would allow for the Inquisition to conscript Rainier in our fight against Coryphaeus. Colin thought it best if we bring our ward home in a covered wagon, reasoning it would not do for the Inquisitor to ride through Valroy with a criminal at her side. At least surrounded by our troops it would appear to be serious business rather than some whim of the Inquisition. It was serious business, and by all accounts I was making a terrible mistake. No one, not even Tom Rainier, supported my decision. Yet how could I leave him behind? He'd been at my side since before Coryphaeus had a name. He was the one who taught me how to wield my staff like a blade, who defended the townsfolk the night Haven fell, who journeyed to the Fade and back with us at Adamant. I knew him to be loyal and good and true. What did it matter if he hadn't always been so? Those thoughts stretched the journey back to Skyhold into an eternity, and tension weighed what little conversation we made. While Salas and Cassandra found common ground on their mutual disappointment in my decision to extradite Blackwell, Varric and I struggled to reconcile what we knew of the man with what we had learned. I dunno, Boots. After Anders, anything less than setting the world on fire seems like a walk in the park. By that measure, Child of the Stone, the Templar who killed Cole must have been having a picnic. Listen, Chuckles, I'm not saying this ain't some bad shit, 'cause it's bad shit. I'm only saying that I've lost any sense of perspective when it comes to betrayal. Did I tell you the one about my brother? Blackwell didn't betray us. Cassandra made a disgusted noise. The Dalish must have a peculiar understanding of the word, Inquisitor. We have a whole god dedicated to betrayal, Cassandra. We get it. But Blackwell. Rainier, Salas interrupted, flicking a piece of lint from his robe. Fine. Rainier. Whatever his name, how many times has he risked his life for ours? So there's a number, then, said Cassandra. A tipping point where murderers become heroes. What about, what's his name? The one that killed Andraste, the Magister. Dorian told me it's his sword on the Inquisition's crest. I should have known you'd take your questions about the Chantry to a Tevinter. Salas. I asked in exasperation. Archon Hessarian. Right. So what if Andraste's followers killed the Archon right there? You wouldn't even have a Chantry. That is debatable. Now you're being obtuse. Have I stood in your way, Inquisitor? Do what you will with this Blackwell. It was the first time Cassandra and I had ever truly been at odds. At least, the first time since I'd graduated from prisoner to Herald of Andraste. Then again, perhaps Varric wasn't the only one whose sense of perspective was irreparably damaged. The truth was, I couldn't forget the voice of a nightmare taunting Blackwell, "You are nothing like a Grey Warden." I'd been trying to forget that filth since we stepped out of the Fade, but knowing that its words grew from a kernel of truth made my blood run cold. Herr Ellen. When we returned to the keep, I went to my chambers to meditate, letting electricity roll across my skin until I could breathe without a lump catching in my throat, until my heart rate fell, until I could feel stillness instead of panic in my thoughts. We were all still living under the nightmare's threat, every one of us waiting to be found out and free from it at last. It told Cassandra that I was a fraud, and perhaps she was kneeling at an altar of her own believing it to be true. Perhaps it was. I took the time to bathe and change into my finery, the game would continue after all, then sent word to Josephine that I was ready. The Great Hall was more densely packed than I had expected, but they weren't there for Blackwell. They were there to see how the Inquisitor would handle her own. If I could exile or execute a man appointed to my inner circle, what could a sodding recruit hope for? I sat uneasily on the throne, and whatever Josephine had said, I fell deaf at the sight of Blackwell being led through the great hall in chains. Oh, gods, he was a mess. The Orlshian soldiers had given him more than a few parting blows. What did you have to do to release me? He all but spat. Josephine called in a few favors. And what happens to the reputation the ambassador has so carefully cultivated? The world will learn how you've used your influence. They'll know the Inquisition is corrupt. Oh. At least he'd taken the bit about not pretending seriously. You could have left me there. I accepted my punishment, I was ready for this all to end. Why would you stop it? What becomes of me now? You have your freedom, I said, willing my voice to be calm. It cannot be as simple as that. It isn't. You're free to atone as the man you are, not the traitor you thought you were or the warden you pretended to be. The man I am. He said the words like he'd never considered such a person before. I have a lot to make up for. If my future is mine, then I pledge it to the Inquisition. My sword is yours. I bit my lip, waiting for the swell of emotion to pass, and then he decided to kick. If I'd said anything less, would an arrow from the rookery have snuffed me like a candle? You're done pretending, Tom Rainier, I said, rising to my feet. But I will pretend you never said that. He didn't meet my gaze again, not even when a guard approached to release him. I felt sick. I waved off Josephine and all but ran from the dais, stepping left instead of right in my panic. To the void with it, at least I could get a nip of brandy from Dorian. I pushed open the heavy door to the stairwell, flinging it shut and missing a beat before realizing that it didn't slam. I turned to find Salas, palm on the door, looking even more disgusted with me than Rainier. I eased up another step so he could have enough room to slide in and let the door close behind him. I'd not have this conversation with half the hall listening at our backs. I leaned against the wall, shaking from the rush of it, from exhaustion, from lyrium and restoratives, from Blackwell's unexpected accusations, but Salas stood cool and collected, shoulders back and hands clasped behind him. Have you gone quite mad? Apparently. Apparently, she says. He's not even a Grey Warden, you should be thrilled. I'm glad you can joke about abusing the Inquisition's power. You're not being fair. Blackwell was the first person I ever recruited to our cause, Salas. He's my responsibility. Responsibility is not expertise. Action is not inherently superior to inaction. There were no grounds for his extradition, none for his pardon. His fate belonged to the imperial court, why deny his victims justice? I thought hard about that brandy. It was the Grey Warden business all over again, this wild streak of vengeance that ran through him. I ended the civil war in Orlais, I think they can spare one criminal for the Inquisition. Ah. And what of the mages who corrupted my friend? Perhaps you should have rehabilitated them too. Don't forget that Blackwell was with us that day, he risked his life to buy us enough time to break the summoning circle. Would Cassandra have done that for a so-called demon? The point is, another man would have let that crime drag him down a darker path, but Blackwell's been trying to claw his way back ever since. I respect that. I believe what Cassandra told us back in Haven. Whatever we were before, we are now the Inquisition. He just laughed and leaned against the wall, the tips of his ears flushing pink with amusement. I might as well have suggested we broker peace with the Elder One over tea and frilly cakes. Not even Cassandra believes that. Then go commiserate with her. I'd rather see Blackwell. Rainier. I'd rather see a man try to set things right than have him dead at my feet. The world will not return your gentle touch, Inquisitor. It's not the world I'm asking, Salas. The fight left me and I closed the gap between us, reaching to cup his face in my palm. Lightning fast, he snatched my wrist in one hand and threw me against the wall, his lips hot on my ear. I never told you that my touch was gentle, he pitched his voice low so it wouldn't echo, and I have warned you not to push me. My breath caught to feel the sudden hardness pressed against my hip. Gods, it had been 1,000 shoves since that day in Hawen's camp. When he'd said that if he wanted my attention. My mistake. I only caught the part about you having me on my knees. That was a warning. One hand curled warm around my throat. And the bit about possessing me. Also. A warning. I writhed against his hardness. Is that a warning too? Salas buried his face in my shoulder, inhaling deeply before biting my neck and tightening his grip. My heart was racing as I rocked against him. I'd never seen his control so frayed, not even in Halam Shirel. Then as suddenly as it began, he released me. Walk away, Inquisitor. If I had cast anything at all, I'd have brought down the entire wing. He always did that, pulled me, pushed me, right up to the God's forsaken edge before walking away. Or making me walk away. It didn't matter how many times he came to me in the Fade, how many times his mana claimed mine, how many times he pushed his fingers into me, how many times he bowed between my legs. I wanted the rest of him and he would not yield. Or what? He clenched his jaw, the way he always did right before regaining control. Arlath ma, Vihanan, but there is a face I do not wish to show. It scared the shit out of me, whatever it was. The story behind Harellen, the thing that always held him back, the thing that went beyond his trouble with the Dalish, deeper than any risk of pregnancy. It was something awful, truly awful. I knew it in my bones. I want you to show me. You really don't. He backed down another step, but it didn't feel like he was retreating. It felt like he was giving me a head start. He expected me to be afraid, and judging by the death magic that welled in my palm, Amalia did too. I dismissed her with a thought and tried to hold his gaze, but then he did it, took a deep breath and became my sweet Haran once more. It was pity, then, the expression on his face. Even after everything, he thought I was an infatuated little girl. Then I decided there was no line I would not cross to make him understand. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I suddenly forgot Elvin when we were in the Fade, that I didn't hear what the nightmare said? To the void with it, whatever it is. A Shemlin merc murdered an entire noble line, children, elven servants, old men hobbled in their chairs, and for what? Blighted coin? He stole another man's identity, lied to me, to us all, but Blackwell would die for me, and I won't spit on that sort of loyalty because he was once Tom Rainier. Arlath ma, Salas, there is nothing I would not forgive you for. Why won't you believe me? His lips moved, voiceless. I do believe you. There was a crack in the mask, tiny, but if I were clever it just might crumble. Maybe I could keep him after all, if I could say the right thing. What was it? Memories poured through my fingertips. There was one that I needed, one that could save us, surely, one that I'd forgotten. Cole. Cole, who said nothing that did not cut to the heart of our hurt, who told me desperate and pleading, you should ask Salas to bind you too. It took my breath away and I gasped. Salas locked his eyes on mine, some very real thread of panic lacing his features. I want you to bind me. It came out in a rush and the change in him was immediate. His pupils snapped wide and dark, and I remembered him as a hunter in the woods. His eyes searched me, following my valislan beneath the collar of my tunic then back to my mouth. Gods, he was nearly undone. One hand wrapped around the back of my neck, twisting and pulling through my hair to tip my chin up so I couldn't help but meet his gaze. Do you think I am the Iron Bull, playing little games and pretending at power? Do you think there is any word in Thedas that could stop me once I've tasted you? Heat and fear and desire washed over me. Mithel's mercy, stopping him was the least of my concern. I am begging you, Salas. He was on me in an instant, teeth and tongue and mana in a rush of motion. I didn't register that he'd ripped open my tunic until I heard the brass buttons bouncing down the stairs. The world spun around me and I was chest and cheek against the wall, a shock of cold stone that sent me gasping. I didn't quite know what to do. I couldn't turn, couldn't put my hands on him, couldn't kiss, couldn't move except to gasp when he jerked my breastband down around my waist. His mana swelled into mine, displacing any magic that I might have called on, as a rough jerk brought my breeches down around my thighs. Salas shifted his weight and twisted, driving me to my knees beneath him and turning me from the wall. I tried to gather the mana or strength to push back, but he was unrelenting. Magic thundered through me in waves, leaving me senseless and only dimly aware of the stone steps beneath my palms. My breeches were bunched between my legs and cool air on my ass let me know that my smalls were gone too. I meant to call his name but it came out as a half-bitten moan. There were 2 doors at the top of the staircase. I tried to twist around, but the hand in my hair kept me staring at nothing but the straight stretch of stairwell ahead as something hot nudged aside the folds of me. Creators, fuck. Salas bent himself over me, sucked the point of one ear between his lips as a warm hand slid over my mouth. Scream if you like. He pushed inside with one thrust, and I did scream. Gods, I had waited for this man. And now he was where he belonged, and I could not contain him. The fullness of it overwhelmed me, not stretching or splitting, but expanding, my world growing larger to make room for him. Screams bubbled up from the heart of me, from his heart inside me, to die in the palm of his hand. I could do nothing but brace myself and try to quiet the wildness he drove from me. There were people everywhere, just outside the doors. Anyone could. If anyone stepped through, they'd see me on my knees before him, utterly abandoned to my lust. The stairwell seemed to ring with the obscene slap of it, the determined grunts and gasps and the growling satisfaction that he stifled into my shoulder. Satisfaction. His satisfaction. He groaned into another thrust, pushed his mana into mine. And then I realized, he wasn't moving at all. Somewhere along the way he'd grown still and I was fucking myself against him, grinding back for more, and totally lost in it. The realization sent me shuddering desperately around him, breath ragged against his palm as I came and my world clenching around a cock I'd never seen. A self-satisfied chuckle rumbled against my ear. You should learn to pace yourself, Delenn. Gods, pace myself? We were in a fucking stairwell. But in another few thrusts it was clear he was in no hurry, that I didn't have the strength to hold us, and that he didn't care. Salas didn't let up, just kept driving into me until I was crushed against the stairs. Yet somehow it was perfect, every sensation a caress on my skin, every thrust creating delicious friction. Time had stopped, I knew only the pounding rhythm and the taste of elfruit on the fingers across my mouth. The teeth of his wolf bone amulet bit into my back as he arched over me to slide his tongue along the back of my neck. His mana pushed into me, more than he'd ever given before, filling me to bursting. He cast and sparked inside me, a rolling wave of force magic that seemed to bend the world. Silas, gods, June, it was, I could see the fade, could feel the magic of him there, the thickness of him here, and my own helpless grasping for both. He released my mouth to grab my hips with both hands. Arlath ma, Rial, he panted, and my heart could have burst. Arlath ma, s. His fingers dug into me. Like you said it the first time. My stomach churned in excitement and shock, he actually got off on my blasphemy. I hesitated only a moment. Arlath ma, Fenharil. What would have been a wicked groan came out through his clenched teeth and I felt him thrash inside, pumping, giving, at last releasing. He buried his face in the curve of my neck, panting and kissing and whispering things I couldn't even understand. Elven I'd never heard. I struggled to catch my breath, delirious and lost until I felt a cool trickle on my thigh. He was slowly spilling out of me, softening but not withdrawing. I felt as if I were floating away, bolstered by exhilaration and a glut of mana. The steps seemed to be shimmering, light sliding across the stone and speckled with stars. Creators, where did we go from here? How could we ever be content with anything less, how could we even part? Salas adjusted his palm against my mouth, then looped his other arm around my waist to drag me back onto my knees. He cupped my breast and gently pinched, then trailed along my belly, my hips, and down between my legs to the place where we were joined. He stroked his cock where it disappeared inside me, then slick fingers swirled around my clit. I tried to jerk away, overwhelmed, but he held me fast and made soothing sounds in my ear as he traced another glyph against my skin. I couldn't work out the magic, didn't recognize the shape. A thrum of soothing magic shot through the heart of me, the anchor flared of its own accord, and I felt fresh with want as if I'd never had him at all. Arabellas, Vihanan, he whispered, you'll never come for another man. He hardened inside me and resumed his previous pace. Chapter 46, Fade Step. I had no idea how much longer it went on like that. There'd been a snap in the veil, a pocket, a warping, and I'd stopped experiencing time in the traditional sense. The world had turned languid and thick, hazy. Salas had abandoned all pretense of keeping me quiet, devoting both hands to my hips and working himself against me at some angle he must have found particularly satisfying. I had to either master myself or be content to let all of Skyhold know that I was being roughly fucked in a stairwell. Choosing the former was far harder than it should have been. I'd given up counting anything so pedantic as an orgasm. This was something else altogether. At some point I became aware of a slow, hollow tick-tocking that felt dark and wrong. Then it grew louder until I realized each concussion had been a footfall, and the distant thunder in fact the latch of the library door tumbling open. In an instant, everything dissolved in shimmering blue light in a rush of motion, speed, energy that gave way to a sense of falling. From a considerable height, should the force of our impact have provided any indication. It took a second to catch my breath and my bearings. Tawny pink sunlight, crisp air, crackling fire, stone all around. We'd landed in the silken sheets of my fluffy human bed. I miscalculated. I dissolved in laughter beneath his weight. Despite everything, solace was still buried in me. Despite everything, I was riding another wave of desire. I wiggled to kick off the breeches bundled around my ankles, pushed up to my knees. He ripped off my already torn tunic, then slowly pulled himself free of me. The emptiness was immediate, aching, hollow, like the world had gone a little dim. I rolled onto my back to look up at him, barely disheveled, breeches pulled down only enough to, against the softness of his ivory fleece tunic, there was something undeniably harsh about the raw length of his cock jutting out between us, slick and hard as marble. I was transfixed. In this as in all things, Solace exceeded the willowy elven men that I'd known. What's more, he'd never been so marvelously real. In the fade, I could only see him as he saw himself, overlaid with my own memories of his chest and arms and fingers, the smell of him, the taste. He was a composite, the idea of Solace we built together. And where I had no knowledge to fill in the gaps, his thoughts did the rest. Now I knew he must consider himself perfectly average. Creators, not so. He tipped up my chin. How long had I been staring, as he took off his wolf bone amulet and surprised me by dropping it around my neck. It thrummed with some unknown enchantment, nature, perhaps. Elemental, maybe. Spirit, certainly. It was no wonder he rarely took it off. I fell back into the pillows, perversely satisfied to be wearing nothing else as I watched him undress. He didn't bother to remove his foot wraps after discarding his trousers, just climbed back on top of me as if fade stepping across Skyhold had only been a minor interruption. His hands schemed up my calves and thighs, then he spread my legs open and kneaded his thumbs in small circles on either side of me. Now he was the one staring, and I could only imagine what a swollen mess he'd made of me. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth and he fell onto me, into me, in one smooth motion, making me whole, complete, full. Quicker still he'd tumbled us round to put me on top. I knew I should sit astride him, should make some show of riding and pleasing, but I couldn't bear the space between us. I wanted his mouth, his tongue, the knowledge that I held him in two places. I rose up on my elbows to ease the sharpness of the amulet between us, and our eyes locked. I lifted and lowered my hips in steady strokes until his breath grew ragged, until his muscles trembled, until his jaw clenched, until it relaxed again as he came for me. "Oh," he breathed, "you are so real." He sounded awestruck, and I tipped over the edge with him once more, awestruck in return. I could have melted, let my mana pool out in all directions, given up the Dalish, the Inquisition, the whole of Thetis. I had him. I had him. I had him. Chapter 47, The Lovers. If I had to claim a home outside of the free marches, I would claim the hinterlands. How many months had we spent mapping those woods? Though I'd been lost in Haven, could still get lost in Skyhold, I could never be anything but home in the rolling hills and rocky streams of the hinterlands. I knew its alas in the solace of my feet. I could feel the shift from loamy soil to clay beneath my toes as we traveled from Dwarf Sun's Pass to Lake Luthias, could tell by the growing thickness of the cool grass when we neared the slow-moving creek that cut north. I knew the rough pebbles that marked the way to Witchwood and the dry slip of pine needles near the forest villa. Those times hadn't been happy, but gods they had been simpler. Before we knew Corypheus, before I'd seen Redcliffe overgrown in red lyrium, before I'd recovered my memories in the Fade, before I'd even found Blackwool. Back when I had only Salas, Varric, and Cassandra, and our problems were no larger than a wicked rift behind Redcliffe Farm. To have the four of us wandering those woods once more felt bittersweet, something like nostalgia, but marred by the knowledge that underneath it all Corypheus had been mining red lyrium all along. How had I kept my toes planted in the earth and missed the twisted feel of him? We all knew the place Bianca had marked on the map, and I'd even cleaned out Valimar once before. Gods damn it, how had I not known? If I could have disrupted his red lyrium supply, would the attack on Haven have gone differently? How many more would still be alive? I'd stopped in my tracks, a little sick at the thought. I hadn't cared a thing for the Inquisition then, only mastering the anchor and shrugging out of an unwanted Shemlin title. Vihanan. Salas fell back to meet me, and I felt suddenly ashamed. He'd joined the Inquisition of his own free will, because he was curious and clever and wanted to help. I'd only been dragged along by circumstance, entirely uninvested until Alexius came along to show me how my failure would taste. Lost in thought, I smiled up at him, content to wallow in my self-pity alone. Though I have traveled the hinterlands many times in the Fade, he said, I have found nothing to suggest a red lyrium mine so near. You really spend most of your time in the Fade? Varric asked, tugging his gloves on a little tighter. As much as is possible. The Fade contains a wealth of knowledge for those who know where to look. Suur. I don't know how you dream, let alone wander around in there. Especially when the shit that comes out of the Fade generally seems pretty cranky. So are humans, but we continue to interact with them, when we must. Cassandra tsked, but otherwise ignored the barb. What about you, Boots? Big fan of the Fade. I laughed. Naturally. You two ever, I dunno, go off on Fade adventures? I had enough presence of mind not to drop my smile at the shock of his question. Salas and I had long ago decided not to speak of our shared time in the Fade. For both of us to have such a rare magic would draw undue suspicion, especially considering the unsavory associations between Corypheus, Tevinter, Somnoborium, and Elven foci. Though you do not visit the Fade in your sleep, Master Tathras, I thought it was common knowledge that dreams are not shared. Right to privacy, I understand, Varric demurred. What Salas means to say is that dreams cannot be shared, said Cassandra, and I realized, no. Salas had meant to say no such thing. He'd simply avoided a lie with one perfectly placed truth, allowing the others to draw all the wrong conclusions. If I hadn't been schooled in the game myself, I would have risked a wink. Gods, he was brilliant. Mages can, Varric insisted, I knew this kid back in Kirkwall, Fenrir. Or is it an elf thing? What? That was not in Tale of the Champion. Oh, Kman, Seeker. You think I'd out a defenseless apostate? If she hadn't been outnumbered by apostates, Cassandra might have taken him to task. As it was, she let it drop, leaving Varric free to resume his former line of interrogation. Fortunately, Salas was not the only one capable of misdirection. So tell us more about Bianca. I'm not making any promises here, he warned, raising his voice as we approached the thundering waterfall. How did you meet? I opted for something safe, easy. I met her years ago in Kirkwall when I was looking for someone with mechanical skills. Bianca is, without a doubt, the most brilliant smith you'll ever meet. I haven't seen her since she got married and moved to Orlais. My mouth formed a perfectly round O of unvoiced surprise. So much for safe and easy. Varric's devotion to Bianca was legendary, and I felt a pang of irritation to discover the feeling was evidently not mutual. So how long have the two of you been? I trailed off as we crossed the head of the stream. Well, if you want to split hairs, we're not, he trailed off as well, waving his hand as if he might conjure the right term. Usually, there's a continent between us at all times. We write letters, now and then we manage to meet up, I don't know if that's together. Shit, it's been what, 15 years? Great. Now I feel old. What in the world happened? We almost started a clan war, does it matter? I can't change it now. No wonder you write such compelling drama, said Cassandra. You live it yourself. Ha. Maybe, but it's the one story I'll never tell. And why bother? My agents convinced the Herald and the Hermit will mop up after the Hawk and the Wolf, thought that one was a little too angsty. I stopped suddenly on the grassy bank, and Cassandra nearly bowled me over. Tell me you're joking. No way, everyone loves a good blooming tide/herring romance. Two elven mages in a story of their own. It's never been done, I'll have the whole genre to myself. Oh my gods. He wasn't even remotely joking. The wild Dalish and a quiet city scholar, he continued, overcoming the odds, saving the world, magic in the air. It's gonna be huge. S-O-L-A-S, said Salas, climbing the rock formation up to the waterfall. It's quite commonly misspelled. Oh my gods. He wasn't even remotely joking either. You are a remarkable woman, Vihanan. Stories will be told. At least you might trust Master Tathras not to twist them in the telling. Few heroes have the luxury of choosing their biographer. I'll only need a couple of quick interviews, just to clear up the bits I didn't see for myself. No. After that business with Vyas and Dorian, I've made peace with fiction, at least it leaves my privacy intact. And what of your legacy? Asked Salas. Either I defeat Corypheus or I don't. I hardly see how it matters what people think of me when it's done. Varric laughed without smiling. Ask Hawk about that sometime. My stomach twisted. Despite his glowing portrait of Kirkwall's champion, Hawk had been turned out of the city she called home and driven underground as an apostate. And Salas was right, my legacy would have lasting implications. Not only for the Dalish, but all elves, perhaps mages too. Gods knew how heavily each of those factors had been held against me when Cassandra first hauled my ass out of the Chantry dungeon. I'll think about it. Two small nugs scattered from sight as we entered the shady cave behind the waterfall, scampering and squealing down the hill behind us. Salas twisted to give me access to his pack, and I fished up the key to Valimar we'd stowed away earlier. It was a heavy thing, black and twisted with age. I threw the bolt to the door and we stepped inside, adjusting to the dim afternoon light that filtered down through the ravine above us. Finally, I started to think you weren't coming. Bianca was standing in the shadows, hood pulled down to obscure her face, and she sounded more than a little put out. Nobody said you had to hang out in the creepy cave while you waited, Varric admonished, his tone inscrutable. Well, I did wait, so let's make this quick, she said, stepping into the wan light. She gave me something of a friendly nod. We'd met earlier in the day, but I'd Salas and Cassandra with suspicion before turning to lead us toward the wide stone bridge. I could see a few darting shadows move along the fringes, then a boulder whistled past my ear as Salas cleared the path across. Bianca turned to raise an eyebrow in thanks, she hadn't even had time to knock an arrow. Her simple bow seemed a curious choice for an accomplished smith, but then again I suppose June himself would have carried nothing more. I'd heard it said that truly accomplished masters most often preferred the simplest of tools. I drew my staff and swept the tip along the floor, bringing it up in a tight hip turn to cast lightning into the shadows. Varric sent a spray of arrows across the terrace. We could count the bodies by their sudden cries. He bumped my fist with his and winked. So this is what you do now. Bianca looked at Varric askance. Beg pardon. Skulking around in caves, shooting guys. This your day today. You're the one who brought us here, I reminded her, feeling protective on his behalf. We proceeded down to the lower level, handily clearing out the few straggling Carta thieves we encountered. Along the nearest wall, Bianca led us to a doorway that had been locked on our previous visit, unyielding even to coal. I built these doors, she explained as she worked the lock. They probably shut this one from the other side when they heard the ruckus. Tada! You've been here often enough to renovate the cave. I don't know if Varric's told you, she said sharply, but the Merchants Guild is cutthroat. You don't say. I built the doors to keep rivals from following me down here and arranging accidents. I guess it's a good thing you came along then. I get that a lot, she said, cocking her head to regard me with some distaste. After you. Even in the dark, I was aware of at least 3 sets of flickering eyes. I stepped forward on my right foot and threw my marked hand into the air, tearing a perfectly spherical rift into the center of the room and wheeling my staff around to cast a ring of lightning. The Carta thugs were almost immediately eaten up by the energy, Salas cast nothing nor did Cassandra draw her sword. I was beginning to wonder exactly why Bianca had brought us here. If she were even remotely competent with her bow she might have handled it herself. As we progressed through the chamber, I could feel the hum of red lyrium in the stone beneath my feet. Its song was anxious, needy, jealous. Deeper in, red lyrium was scattered all about. Piled up in hand carts, growing from the walls, in broken bits scattered across the floor. For the first time in my life, I would have been glad for boots. Salas lazily stretched out his arm and cast a gravity well, sending all the little shards and fragments into a tidy pile in the corner so that we could walk unafraid. Not that Bianca paid him any mind. She strode through the room and straight to a simple wooden desk, producing an ornately fashioned key from the top drawer. In a moment more, she'd locked a nearby door without bothering to open it first. I saw in Varric's expression I wasn't alone in finding her behavior a little suspect. Bianca. You were the one who leaked the Tag's location, I was not asking. It's not like that, not entirely. Shit, she turned around to face us. When I got the location, I went and had a look for myself. And I found the red lyrium and I studied it. Varric was in her face. You know what it does to people. I just wanted to figure it out. Did you? I asked. Actually, yes. I found out that red lyrium, it has the blight, Varric. Do you know what that means? What? That two deadly things combine to form something super awful. Lyrium is alive, I supplied. Or something like it, Bianca cautioned. I couldn't get any further on my own, so I looked for a Grey Warden mage. Blight and magical expertise in one, right? And I found this guy, Larius. He seemed really interested in helping my research, so I gave him a key. Larius? He was the Grey Warden we met in Corypheus's shit. I didn't realize until you said you found red lyrium at Haven. I came here and, well. Wait, Larius is the... He was at the Grey Warden prison where we found Corypheus. And he definitely wasn't a mage before. Oh, gods. I knew how that particular story ended. Hawk had explained it to us all in her initial report, and that meant Bianca had been dealing with Corypheus himself. With Varric and Bianca in obvious need of a heart-to-heart about her indiscretion, Salas and I walked off a few paces while Cassandra roamed the chamber, methodically divesting the Carta thugs of anything useful. I leaned against the ornately carved wall so peculiar to Tags while Salas stood ramrod straight. That would mean Corypheus has been quietly building power in the deep roads, I whispered, for what, 3 years? So it would seem. And the wardens have been compromised ever since. However carefully neutral his features, he was seething at Bianca. I absently thumbed the grip of my staff. When he caught me, back in Haven, Corypheus told me I'd interrupted a ritual years in the planning, I said. But what took him so long? With all that red lyrium he could have unlocked the orb ages ago. Why wait till the conclave? Salas pressed his lips into a hard line, shook his head. Maybe he didn't have it then, I ventured. I slid down the wall to the floor and began uncotting the hala wool rope I kept lashed to my staff. It was a very subtle sort of fire magic, each knot a simple rune and a prayer all at once. Silas. Salas looked down at me. Are you praying or swearing? Thinking, I corrected, pinching his smallest toe. Well, praying a little, which reminded me of how you said the foci channeled power from the gods. Yes. So which god did the orb belong to? A very good question, though perhaps less relevant than whom it belongs to now. True, I said, reknotting the rope and twisting it back into its patterned place. But you've got to be a little curious. I have yet to find any such answers within the ancient texts. Just then, Varric strode past us with Bianca trailing after. Varric. Don't worry about it, he said, so softly and so quietly that my heart broke for him. Bianca paused and turned to me. Get him killed, and I'll feed you your own eyeballs, Inquisitor. It was no coincidence that Salas shifted to step on the hem of my robes, because I had every intention of flying to my feet and hurling her into a wall. He'd seen Syrah push me over that same edge on any number of occasions. I had no patience for a threat. Finethus Lhasa, Durgan Len. I'm not the one supplying red lyrium to Corypheus. For one brief moment, I thought she might actually kick me, and it would have been glorious. But instead, she narrowed her eyes and stalked from the room as if she were still somehow the offended party. All in all, if I had to choose between Biancas, I'd opt for the crossbow. Chapter 48, The Elven Gods Existed. I couldn't resist a stay at the Upper Lake camp. It was selfish, to be sure, but I had so few occasions to sleep in the woods that I could push Varric and Cassandra's preference for Skyhold to the back of my mind. Lake Luthias was safe and familiar, a place of comfort where I would gladly linger if only to soothe the nagging worry of Bianca's revelation. The woman had disappeared by the time we'd climbed back down from the waterfall, but Varric said it was to be expected. Even in the hinterlands, they couldn't risk being seen together thanks to some dodgy Merchants Guild vendetta. Good riddance, so far as I was concerned. Fortunately, the requisitions officer always kept a vat of pottage on the fire, so we took our supper under the stars after shucking our armor. I brought a bowl to Varric, and he accepted it with a tired smile. I sat down beside him on an overturned barrel someone had rolled into camp. Snuggled close, we could afford an approximation of privacy. "How are you feeling?" "I'm glad to have answers," he rasped, "but, shit." Blackwell's past coming to light had been difficult and remained so as most of our companions took his deception personally, though I still held that he hadn't actually betrayed or hurt the Inquisition in any measurable way. Bianca, on the other hand, shared a secret that wasn't hers to share and helped Corypheus to an extent that was hard to overstate. A steady supply of red lyrium and unfettered access to the deep roads? That meant strength and stealth and years of safe harbor underground. The second she showed up here, I knew. I let this mess happen. I leaned into him until our shoulders bumped. "You can't be faulted for trusting someone you love." I said no more. Varric knew betrayal better than most. From Anders to Bartrand and now Bianca, he must have kept a horrible list of what-ifs. He certainly didn't need me to heap coals onto that fire, not when he still held himself somehow responsible for Corypheus escaping the Warden prison. The point is, I don't deal with things. If Cassandra hadn't dragged me here, I would be in Kirkwall right now pretending none of this was happening. At the sound of her name, Cassandra looked up from across the fire but said nothing to interrupt me. "Think what you will, Varric, but this isn't your mess to clean up. Corypheus has always been the driving force behind this disaster, we're all just casualties. Except if Bartrand and I hadn't. Then why not go back a step more and blame Anders for stealing the Deep Roads map that got you there in the first place? Why am I not surprised to hear of another Grey Warden in this misbegotten tale?" Salas frowned. His mood had darkened considerably since we left Valimar, and he made no pretense of eating. "Cassandra, why do you think Corypheus chose the Temple of Sacred Ashes?" I asked, hoping to refocus the blame where it belonged. She laughed without mirth. "The Magisters of Tevinter despise our chantry and our divine." "Hubris," said Salas. "So he might rise to divinity on the back of another. Then why not attack at the heart of it all in Valroio? Why cross the waking sea to Ferelden? He's crazy, Boots. There's no understanding it. When his cranky ass woke up, first order of business was praying to Dumat and demanding our fealty. All the more reason to go back to Tevinter, seek help from the somnoborium of his own gods. How does an orb associated with the Elven Pantheon come into play?" "Perhaps he wished to defile all the gods of Thedas," said Cassandra. "Or maybe the Elven gods are more powerful," I suggested. "Well, that's my cue," said Varric, rising to his feet. "After nearly a decade stuck between Daisy and Sebastian, the last thing I want to hear is another debate on Elven/human religion. Good night, everyone." I wobbled on the barrel as it rolled back, but it was morbid curiosity that made me grab the hem of his duster. No, you have to tell me what Meryl said." "Not much to tell," he said. "She believes the creators abandoned your people for not being elfy enough when shit went down in Arlathan." "Oh, okay," I laughed, releasing him. "Enjoy your dreamless sleep." He patted my shoulder once before disappearing into the shadows, ever the rogue. "Why is that so funny?" Cassandra asked, and I waited until my ears caught the rustling of a tent flap by the water's edge before responding in a hushed tone. "Because his friend Daisy is unhinged." She can't conceive of a world where the gods could be betrayed as easily as she betrayed her keeper and her clan. Fuck that, the Dalish don't need firsts like that. The Dread Wolf can keep her. And yet you worship him, do you not? Cassandra and I had often spoke on matters of faith back in Haven, so she had at least a passing familiarity with my thoughts on the Pantheon, though she seemed to think gods were something I collected and once asked why I did not add the Maker to my prayers. Fearfully so, he earned the right. This I did not know, said Salas, raising an eyebrow. Have you ever inquired after my beliefs, or do you just pocket them as keepsakes? I put no malice in the words, and he splayed a hand to concede my point, the most he'd ever done to acknowledge the fate of my Sylvanwood ring. Cassandra probably missed the reference, but she could not disguise her curiosity on the subject. Salas, if you do not mind me asking, what do you believe in? Cause and effect, he said matter-of-factly, wisdom is its own reward, and the inherent right of all free-willed people to exist. That is not what I meant, she said. I know, he smiled. I believe the elven gods existed, as did the old gods of Tevinter. But I do not think any of them were gods, unless you expand the definition of the word to the point of absurdity. I appreciate the idea of your maker, a god that does not need to prove his power. I wish more such gods felt the same. I couldn't help but laugh. Emma Lath believed in our gods, but appreciated the maker. Cassandra couldn't have asked for a better setup. You have seen much sadness in your journeys, Salas. Following the maker might offer some hope. I have people, Seeker. The greatest triumphs and tragedies this world has known can all be traced to people. The gift of free will is ours to abuse or to honor, she said. On that we can agree. She rose and tossed her bowl and tankard into a wash bin, then nodded her good nights. Salas returned the gesture and I managed a smile as she walked past to join Varric in his tent. That's how it had always been in the early days, when I'd been too damn scared of humans and dwarves to sleep by anyone but Salas. I didn't realize it then, but it was a testament to Varric's compassion that he consented to the arrangement. Or perhaps he'd seen how poorly the Dalish handled culture shock. I was glad that we'd fallen back into that familiar pattern. Salas and I only rarely bunked together in camp, but we had not spent a night apart since. Yet something prickled beneath our conversation that night, the edge of tension that always cut along our differences, and I was not sure how it would play out. I still want to know which god the orb belonged to. It would be far more pertinent for us to learn how Corypheus thwarts death with the Grey Wardens. Yes, well, you're not the who's been branded. Is that how you think of the anchor? His features softened dramatically, and he came to sit beside me. I dropped my head on his shoulder. It did feel like a brand, something I'd burned myself on by mistake, and there wasn't a mage in Thedas who didn't immediately peg its energy as elven and strange. Salas had told me long ago it was the power of our gods, but the reality of that statement had only begun to sink in. At first, I had been too overwhelmed by Skyhold, by my smite, by our time in the Fade, by the machinations of Halam Shirel, but now, the implications seemed almost unavoidable and the creators no longer felt so abstract. What if it's Elgar'nan? I whispered. That would trouble you. Of course it would trouble me. I'm not keen on being a light with vengeance. Salas snaked one arm around my waist, pulling me closer. And who would you prefer? I should think it obvious, I teased. He twisted to kiss my forehead, right in the tangle of sylvanwood on my brow. Why June? I grinned, for once having caught him in a trap of my own. So you do recognize my Valislan. And what Dalish would teach you such a thing? It's very private. They are very clearly tree branches, he said in his best Haran voice. It should be obvious to anyone familiar with Dalish lore. I hummed with good-natured skepticism. He'd probably watched the ritual in the Fade. The other gods created out of nothingness, or out of destruction. Even Silas needed wood to burn. But June taught us how to use what we already have, how to make the most of the world we've been given. That's always seemed beautiful to me. And you would bear his mark twice. Better him than Phalandin or... You should not dwell on it. But when the orb has been recovered, do you think we can puzzle out who it belonged to? I am certain of it. It contented me to have anything aside from death and destruction waiting on the other side of the battle to come. What more was there to say? I stood and offered Salas my hand, tugging him to his feet. There was something stormy to his gaze in the firelight, perhaps from all the dry observations on religion he was willing to swallow on my behalf. That was all right. If he could leave room for my belief, I could leave room for his objectivity. We stood for a moment regarding each other. I was still overwhelmed by how much had changed between us in only a few weeks. Salas was hungry in a way I'd never known a man to hunger before, and it never failed to twist at the heart of me to know I stood at the center of it. It put fire into our skirmishes with the Templars and our conversations at Skyhold, and when we were left alone it seemed to consume us. It couldn't burn forever. I knew better than to think any relationship could maintain such relentless intensity, but for the moment it was everything. The dirt still felt warm beneath my toes and the night air was mild, so instead of ducking into the tent just beside the campfire, I took slow steps along the southern path back toward Valimar. It would, perhaps, be my only chance in the foreseeable future to have him as I longed to, away from human beds and buildings and the tents of the Inquisition. I put a gentle sway into my hips and set each footstep one in front of the other, then unfastened the belt that held my loose robes in place. I spared a glance over my shoulder as they fell free, satisfied to see Salas following a few paces behind, something fierce in his gaze. There was a blur of motion and light, and then he had my back against a tree. I laughed, reveling in the feel of rough bark against my skin and the surprising ways in which Salas always brought his magic to bear. I looked up at him, the anchor casting emerald light into the trees above, and ran my tongue along his neck before nipping at the edge of his jaw. "Who do you think I belong to?" I whispered, my tone a clear departure from our previous conversation. "Me." I leaned up on tiptoes to put my mouth on his, rocking myself against him to be clear that I agreed. Chapter 49, Leaf-Eared Lover. I woke before Salas on the small island in the middle of Luthias, snapping back into my body after a strange night of wandering the Fade. For the first time since Ar Lathma, he had not joined me, though it felt selfish to pout when he had one leg slung over mine and a hand grasping at my breast, his thumb worrying across my nipple. I eased myself from his hand. It had been the tightness of his grip that woke me, and I twisted in his arms to find his forehead creased with worry. Deprived of one comfort he took another, palming my ass, and I couldn't help but chuckle. If he'd been another man I would have tried to wake him, but I knew better than to draw him from the Fade without good reason. Instead, I brushed my knuckles across his temple to smooth away the scowl. My fingers twitched to cast a fire rune deep in the earth beneath us to drive away the dew, and I shifted so his head fell against my chest. The sun was newly up and casting long shadows through the crumbling of our ruins around us, and I wondered if that's where he'd gone. We shared a fascination with Tirda Bright Axe, could each recite all 6 stanzas by heart. Sometimes, when it suited him, he'd bury himself inside me with a whispered fragment of verse. Beast no blade could break came roaring, mountains slipped their winter gown. I'd never expected to fall for a scholar, the sort of man who'd bring poetry to passion. It certainly wasn't the Dalish way of things, but rather something to be expected of a courtier. Indeed, the more time we spent together in the wake of Halam Shirel, where I'd stepped into the Winter Palace as a pretender, the more I came to realize what others could not. Salas was pretending too. Once my second-hand hurt subsided, I thought it remarkable that Dorian was able to recognize something unique about Salas belonging to neither the city elves nor the Dalish. Yet by turning it into a joke about snowflakes he'd missed the obvious implication: Salas had been raised among nobility. If not in alienage or Aravels, where else did the elves find shelter? In every palace, castle, chateau, and dog-lord manor. In Briola and Fenris I'd come to know this shadow caste, minds and tongues sharper than their ears, quick to puzzle out political posturing, fluent in many languages, savvy to the corrupting influence of power, fond of fine wine and freedom, and proud to a fault of their Shemlin lovers. Salas hid it well. In the homespun cloth of his robe, the scarcity of his possessions, his bare feet, and the pelts and bones and crystal trappings of a shaman. He hid himself in spells that burned bright and careless, in the humility of an elven servant at Halam Shirel, where I'd never seen him more confident. In darker moments, I feared he hid it in me as well. He hid himself well enough to fool those accustomed to looking down, but with Salas I was ever and always looking up. I thought the measured cadence to his voice spoke of formal education, and I saw culture in the flowing curve of his script. He kept stacks of books in languages both ancient and modern, but never paused to consult them when translating for us in the field. There was social sophistication in his gentle laugh and nobility in the persistent tilt of his chin. What city elf ever learned to hold his head so high? In 1,000 tiny ways that any vagrant could see, Salas did not belong. I'd spent my life living hand to mouth, so I found our differences stark and sometimes shameful. When my dirty feet met his pink and clean in our silken sheets, when Josephine stole away my threadbare tunics while his were always carefully mended. Even when Salas surprised me with frilly cakes in bed, and I could only pretend to enjoy them, far too rich and sweet for an elf who'd never tasted more than a lick of honey from bee-stung fingers. The entire Inquisition jokingly resigned his eccentricities to the Fade, but the truth was that no one cared. We had apostates on the loose, undead rising, a war-torn empire to rebuild, Templars smuggling lyrium, and Coryphaeus on the horizon. If one unassuming elf seemed to know too much, what of it? Shemlin society preferred its elves invisible. At the Winter Palace, no one even noticed us murdered one by one. As Salas slept in my arms, frowning in the Fade, I puzzled out a theory of my own. He'd been born in a village to the north, perhaps his mother a lady-in-waiting to Ternacaus land in Highever, or his father a steward to Ban Trevelyan in Ostwick, if not the gentle prince of Starkhaven. I could conceive of no other station that would embolden an elven woman to name her son Pride. In a noble house, a bright elven child with clever ears could listen, absorb some little lord's lessons for himself and build hope for the future. If he showed promise, he might receive lessons of his own in turn, horseback riding, archery, courtly graces, and leisurely pursuits to while away time with the master. There was no lord in Thedas that did not value a well-trained elf. The indignity of the sentiment burned me deeply enough to think shame alone would keep Salas from confessing. It was no wonder Salas softened around Syrah, cheering for Red Jenny as she chipped away at the aristocracy from the inside out. Such a life would neatly account for his competence in ballrooms and battlefields alike, as well as his fastidious manner and refined tastes. I imagined he fled when his power grew beyond hiding, or more likely when his thirst for knowledge exceeded what he found among the Shem. So he'd sought shelter among the Dalish, found peace for a time, perhaps love, or at least someone to warm his bed. Since he would not take Valislan, it was inevitable that they would turn him out, so Salas would have wandered until he found another clan to begin the cycle again. Until I could all too easily imagine 1,000 ways such circumstances might eventually drive a mage to something as dark as Harellen. Was it an accident or the same righteous rage that killed those mages in Durthaveren? The nightmare could have simply said traitor to stir Cassandra and the others against him, but he'd chosen something Dalish, he'd chosen something to undermine my confidence in particular. But why? Oh, gods, not knowing was so much worse than whatever it was. I held Salas more tightly, his wolf bone amulet sharp against my skin. Chapter 50, It was a game. The Crow Fens proved to be a rather abysmal sort of place despite the stark beauty of lily pads floating on the glassy water. In a single day we'd killed a dozen common wyverns, found a Fade rift to close, and even slain a high dragon, yet the snowy wyvern eluded us. I'd begun to wonder if it were the terribly fearsome creature Vivian suggested, or merely rare. We'd stayed overnight at the Fens camp to ensure our mounts would be fresh for the ride back to Skyhold the moment we'd killed one. Even with ice and an enchanted container from Danya, time would be of the essence. There were precious few hours for Vivian to craft a potion from a white wyvern's heart. As it stood, the heart was still out there, somewhere, beating. I hadn't been keen on the task, but I'd played enough of the game to know that helping Vivian would buy her continued loyalty for a time. She was an unstoppable force with her spirit blade, and I was not eager to lose her favor while Coryphaeus held a dragon by the tail. So before such matters grew urgent, I brought Cole and Blackwool with me and Salas to Gilanane's Grove in search of the beast. I hadn't intended for Salas to come along. He'd been slipping deeper and deeper into his research and it seemed a shame to distract him. Besides that, we hadn't traveled to Durthaveren together since his friend was killed and I figured he'd be loath to help Vivian even indirectly. Yet when I'd popped into the rotunda to say my goodbyes, he'd pinned me to the wall and declared that I could not escape him so easily. It sent my heart skipping to think he was the one who could not bear a night apart. My time with you is precious, he'd said. So I'd made a show of urging Vivian to remain at Skyhold to prepare for her concoction, and the four of us set out on our own. After a day in the Fens, we were ready to be done. I moved carefully through the marsh, mindful of things hidden in the placid water that rose about my waist. Humans would never appreciate the sensation, but to feel the broken bones and rotted wood and crumbling ruins beneath my toes told me so much more about the place than a booted foot would ever know. It made history something real, something solid, and true instead of mere words on a page. Ugly things lurked beneath the surface to be sure, but they were no less ugly if I avoided them. Ahead of me, Blackwool crashed through the marsh in careless splashes, but Cole and Salas picked their way through with great care, neither leaving more than a ripple in the water that reached only their thighs. He stands tall. So tall. None like him, my pride. I love him, I love him, I love him, said Cole, and I flushed to the tips of my ears. Cole, Salas cautioned. Cole cocked his head, latching onto some new thread that only he and Salas understood. It was a game, but more than a game. It meant he would get a family. Competition brings passion, Cole, and passion lets people attach import to trivial things. Why didn't they help at the end? People wish to accomplish the truly great things on their own. They didn't give the boy what he wanted, Cole lamented. They did, said Salas. The boy got a family. They gave him a new one. He wanted his old one. I would have done it better, he all but pouted. The wise must sometimes give people what they need, not what they want. I schemed up a lily pad from the water, wondering, was Salas that boy? Did he compete in a tourney, get traded from one noble house to another? Oi, what's this? My thoughts were cut short at Blackwool's interjection, and I glanced up to see a statue jutting up between the lily pads. Blackwool pulled up a waterlogged journal, legible only because of a mild enchantment on the pages. I glanced through it, laughing at the Orlshian scholar who dubbed it broken dog when it was clearly a wolf. I would have been content to leave the blighted thing alone had not Cole put too fine a point on it. So many eyes peering from underneath. For an instant, one perfect memory from before I'd woken up in Haven churned to the surface, twisted rocks in the fade, sickly green light, burning pain in my palm, and 6 red eyes stalking from the shadows. I froze, then dragged my eyes down to the water where the wolf head was thrown back in a howl. It was one thing to walk away from Fenharel's statue, but another to do so after a spirit suggested his many eyes were watching. Blackwool, would you help me? My lady. I need to pull this thing out of the water, it's too heavy. All right, let's see. He moved beside me and I stepped back to give him room as he rocked the stone in the water, freeing it from the muck. Then with a heave-ho he lifted it into his arms and stood. Tell me we're not carrying the mud back to Skyhold. No, no. Here, I said, guiding him with my hands to position the stone where it had once belonged. Can you hold it there? Like this. Perfect. I shouldered my staff and placed my palms on the broken stone, pushing a little to line up the edges. Then I let my eyes roll back as I found the magic still within it, a remnant of some long-dead keeper. I called to the song of its carving and laced it with my own magic, a spell that I hadn't used in years. There was an awful scraping sound as the pieces joined together, and then it was done. Blackwool stepped back in surprise, but the statue held. I touched my forehead to the stone, but stopped the enamel on my tongue. Can you all just give me a moment? He wants to watch you worship, said Cole, and I chuckled, quite certain Salas would have a few choice opinions on the grammar of my prayers, not to mention their content. Then again, he might have been Blackwool from Cassandra. I'd learned how curiously Andrastians regarded Dalish belief. Even so. This is between me and Fenharel. It was Blackwool who cleared his throat, leading the retreat on my behalf. When they'd sloshed off a few yards, I cast a spirit ward around the statue, familiar magic that I hadn't called on since leaving my clan, then took a moment to clean away the creeping moss and driftwood piled up at its base. I stood on my toes to lay a kiss on the wolf's neck, the sort of fearful offering only a keeper might give. Ene Durjan Melavatelin asked, Irabellas. Ene Nan Nadas, Fenharel, Savunin Salin Serenas, Emma Halani tu Salas. Satisfied that I'd honored whatever duties I still carried as first, I rejoined the others on the rocky knoll where they sat sipping restoratives. Salas passed 2 vials to me, a restorative and a lyrium. I believe I sense one of the artifacts of my people, he said, nodding in a northerly direction. I wasn't even sure he realized the jab, whenever I did something just a little too Dalish, his pronouns shifted. The elves. My people. I popped the cork on the restorative and took it all at once, shuddering at the fresh wave of energy that raced through me, but I held back on the lyrium. Salas misjudged, my mana reserves were not so low. Lead on, Harin. Relaxing into the energy of the veil, I could sense it too, and was chagrined when we stepped forward together in perfect unison. There was an odd mix of comfort and exasperation in the way he could, from moment to moment, other me as Dalish while remaining so perfectly in sync with my movements. Of course it turned out that the blighted artifact was at the base of the most elaborate shrine to Fenharil I'd ever seen, a huge stone mass nearly half the length of the Great Hall. I left Salas to activate the device while I ascended the steps and walked across the narrow pier. At the end stood two howling wolves, one white, one black. Between them, a stone altar laid with bowls of water and a vase of bulrushes. In a moment, I felt the warmth of Salas at my back. There was once an Eluvian here, he said, gesturing to the shape between the wolves. Indeed, the outline would have perfectly fit Morrigan's towering Eluvian, and I felt a rush of excitement to think of the place as a bustling intersection in ancient times. I turned around with my back to the altar, softening my voice so it would not carry. If we slept here, do you think we could dream back far enough to see the people? He shook his head. I would not recommend it, too many restless spirits are drawn to this place. Do you think he came here? The wolf. Or the man, I shrugged, reaching back to grab a bulrush as if from a quiver, then knocking it into an invisible bough. I took careful aim at Salas, smiling. I don't suppose Paws could manage Phalassin. I presume it's a metaphor, he said dryly. You sound like Mother Giselle. He laughed. A wise woman. Kmin, I said, dropping the bulrush. Let's find our wyvern. Check the description for the links to the author.